Hello world, you are listening to Feel Good. I'm your host, Malika Lee. Today's topic is conscious dating. And whether you are newly single, whether you're resigned, or maybe cynical about dating a little bit like I found out I am, or whether you are zest and fully charged about dating like my guest, we have something great in store for you. So I'm excited to have with me Laurie Cash Richards, who is a life coach, author, speaker, workshop facilitator, and an expert enthusiastic dater. Welcome, Laurie.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. All right, so like I like to ask most of my guests, I shared a little bit about what you do. Will you share with us, what matters to you?
Oh, gosh, as a spiritual psychologist, the words that come forward for me are the whole human family matters to me. I just think my purpose is to help us remember who we truly are and what our purpose here on the earth is. And I think conscious dating or enthusiastic dating can just be such a beautiful way of experiencing ourselves as we truly are at an authentic self level.
That sounds beautiful. And for some listeners may not be familiar with the term spiritual psychologist. So what does that mean?
Well, I got a master's degree in 2011 from the University of Santa Monica. And all they do are master's degrees in spiritual psychology. And so basically the simplest version of what it means to be a spiritual psychologist is we look at life through the lens of the soul. So instead of a human being with a soul, I see life as we are souls having a human experience or using a human experience for our growth, learning, and upliftment.
Oh, so I totally understand when you're saying dating presents a lot of opportunities. Oh boy. Okay. Yes, for growth.
Learning and upliftment.
And upliftment. Okay, yes, thank you.
We have to think about it a certain way. We do. And we need support. We all do.
Yes, we do. So, can you just share with our listeners a little bit about your dating history so they have context?
Yes. So, I was married for 17 years. I've been divorced for 13 years, and I've been online dating for about a year. So for the first 12 years after my divorce, I didn't go online at all. It terrified me. It really did. And I had boyfriends and one long-term boyfriend, and I had an overall positive experience. And then I thought, my dad would always say to me, if you want something you've never had, you have to do something you've never done.
Yes.
And so I thought, I'm going to go up the learning curve of online dating. And I'm just going to go in with an open heart and an open mind and have the experience that I have. And I set an intention. It was almost exactly a year ago. So it was April of 2018. I set a very clear intention to go on 20 dates in 60 days.
Wow.
Because I really wanted to support myself in saying yes more than I said no. Because I really wanted to experience what it was like for me when I was sitting in front of a man that I didn't know. I was just as curious about how I would show up as how the man would show up. And then how we would relate and how we would interact. And I have met some lovely, lovely men. And it's been a year. I did 18 dates in those 60 days.
Wow.
So I almost made it to my goal of 20.
Yes.
But then in the last year, I think I've been out with about 50 different men.
Hence the term expert that I referenced earlier.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm an expert, but I certainly have some experience. And, I'll tell you, I've just had a lot of fun, and I've met some really lovely people. And one of the intentions that I have is to make the choice that requires the most courage. And so showing up on these dates and just showing up online requires a certain level of courage. And I think we have to give ourselves credit for that. We don't give ourselves enough credit for just the pure strength of heart it takes to put up a profile, to put up some pictures, and to say, here I am, who wants to date me?
Right.
You know,
Yes.
it's vulnerable. And so it's been the whole spectrum of the emotional experience. And I was going to say it's been fun, and it has been fun, but it's been everything else as well.
So I was watching Brene Brown's lecture on Netflix, and she said in one part, in the Netflix episode is called The Call to Courage, and she was saying, who wants to have more love in their life? Who wants to have more intimacy and more connection? Of course, everyone in the audience was raising their hands. And then she said, well, we have to be seen in order to have more love and more connection.
I haven't seen this yet.
Oh,
I need
you
to
haven't?
watch it. No,
Yes.
definitely need to watch this.
Check it out. And
Yeah.
so then what was so wonderful is that right away, as soon as she said that, my mind went to how my setting on a current dating app is set to invisible. And so I was like, well, quite literally, the love, right? If they don't know I exist, the love and the connection that I say I'm wanting, that perhaps I'm getting in my own way with that, which is why I mentioned in preparing for our conversation, I realized I had a cynical outlook, which is so surprising for me. And the cynical definition that I found online that resonated was doubtful as to whether something will happen or whether it is worthwhile. And so when you were speaking about your first intention of the 20 dates in 60 days, I'm wondering, like, what was the bigger intention? Like you mentioned, as far as inwardly and showing up and the courage, but as far as, is there an intention about the type of person you wanted to meet that kind of kept you optimistic and going as well, or any other outcomes as far as meeting this person?
To answer honestly, there really wasn't an intention around the man that I wanted to meet. Not at first, because I really had no idea what was out there. And so it was really just like exploration and discovery at first. And I said yes a lot more than I said no, just for the pure explorative nature of finding out who's here, who's online, who are these men,
and who are they?
Exactly.
What did you find? What would you say? Who are they?
You know, I found so many really lovely people, devoted fathers, hard workers, kind, generous, compassionate. Like, I found a lot of really good people. Now, what I didn't find was a great fit for me until recently.
Right.
But I'm so grateful for the experience of sitting across from so many that weren't a great fit. Because then when the great fit showed up, he was almost instantly recognizable to me. Almost instantly. And I haven't said that out loud before, so thank you for interviewing me about this. So did I answer your question?
You did.
Okay, good.
You did. And we were going to get into who this guy is and what you learned and discovered and what made him such a clear yes, it sounds like, for being right for you. So listeners, you got to continue to stay tuned, right? There's hope. There's hope. So we're talking about conscious dating. What would you say is conscious dating versus just regular dating?
Such a good question, Malika. I think conscious dating has to do with where I'm coming from as a dater. Not where the person sitting across from me is coming from, but where I'm coming from. And part of my intention as I went up the learning curve, it took me about 6 months to kind of get to this intention. So I didn't start with this intention. But what I realized is, one of the opportunities presenting itself to me is for me to show up in my own loveliness, regardless of who's sitting across from me, regardless of whether he's a good fit for me or not. You know, I spoke about how I just have this affinity for the whole human family. And this is one of us sitting across from me, and to treat him with respect, not because of who he is, and even if he's disrespectful. And I had that, a couple of times. But to continue to treat him with respect, not because of who he is, but because of who I am. And I think online dating can be a real practice in just consciousness. Like, not even just conscious dating, but bringing, a quality. I did this kind of fun exercise. And again, I just started this maybe a month or so ago, maybe 2 months ago. and I've been probably out on 15 dates in the last 2 months. And so I would take the first letter of the man's name.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say his name is Steve. And I would ask for a quality to be cultivated in me that night while I was with him. So with Steve, let me think of a quality I might have come up with. So with the letter S, serenity.
Okay.
So I might just before I go into the date, set an intention of having an experience of serenity.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually really lovely to track that
Mm-hmm.
as I went along. And then think about it on the other side of the date. Did I have an experience of that or didn't I?
Mm-hmm.
And so it added it was a way of supporting myself in a vulnerable situation too,
Mm-hmm.
because we as women, we're vulnerable, and these men are vulnerable too.
Right.
When we go in and we have no idea really, because what my experience has taught me is you can text and talk all day long.
Right.
And not know anything about chemistry. I had the most hysterical conversations, and I thought I was going to have all kinds of chemistry with a couple of guys. And then when we were actually sitting across from each other, we were still having a hysterical conversation,
Mm-hmm.
but there was no chemistry in terms of either one of us
Mm-hmm.
wanting to, take this any further than just a really funny, happy conversation.
Yes. Yes.
So I can't stress enough that part of the learning is the faster we can move into face-to-face contact with somebody, the better.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, because, and at first, if you're new to online dating, really trust your own pacing. But as we get more and more familiar, I found out I was wasting a lot of time messaging or even talking on the phone, because that experience that we only get face to face, it's so important. And the way I think about it too is I have lots of friends. I love my friends, and I'm always looking for new friends, and I'm friends with a couple of these guys, but there's one spot to fill, and it's the spot of partner. And I think it brings me back to intention. Being very intentional about filling and finding the partnership, the good fit,
Mm-hmm.
because there's really just one spot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's so many follow-up questions I have to all those things that you just said. For our listeners, if you're just tuning in, this is Malika Lee, your host of Feel Good, and today I'm speaking with Laurie Cash Richards, who is, among many things, a life coach, an author, and as you've probably noticed by now, an expert, enthusiastic dater. And we're talking today about conscious dating. So my follow-up question, and there's a lot of good ones in there, one is around boundary setting. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned how you set an intention of how you show up, which is really all that we have influence and control over with dating, is how we show up. And you said sometimes people weren't respectful. And so I'm wondering, how did you set boundaries, or how did you navigate those situations?
Such a great question, because I didn't know how to navigate those situations until I was literally in them. Mm-hmm. And so I'll give you an example of one. I was sitting across from a man at Starbucks, and I was not feeling any chemistry whatsoever, really less than zero. Truthfully. And I was kind of sitting back in my chair, and I think I even had my arms folded, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and all of a sudden, he gets up out of his seat, he leans across the table, and he kisses me on the mouth.
Wow, that's intense.
You know what I did? I completely ignored him. I acted like it hadn't happened, because I was shocked, first of all, mm-hmm. and I was astonished that he could be misreading the experience that I was having.
Which sounds like the complete opposite of the experience he was having.
Well, I don't even know. I think he was kind of in his own world, and the languaging and the conversation we were having was quite one-sided. And so I think there was this misunderstanding that somehow I was going to acquiesce to his perspective. And that's never going to happen.
He didn't know about
He
who he
didn't know
was
about
dealing with.
that. And so I just realized I need to complete this quickly. And so I just said, I think I need to go. And he stood up and he walked out to my car with me. And I thought, okay, how this guy thinks he's going to kiss me before I get in my car and drive away. And so as I was walking out to my car, I centered myself. And I found myself saying, I put my car door between me and him. And I said to him, I think I might be too radical for you. Because he was very, very conservative. And so, not politically, but just in terms of, I don't even know how he was politically, but just, there was just this expectation that I would, like I said, acquiesce to his leadership. And I literally thought to myself, I'm going to blow this guy away if he actually were to ask me a question and I were to answer it. But never happened.
He never asked you a
question.
He
never asked me a question. So, but my own sense was, I'm way too radical for him. I'm a spiritual psychologist, for heaven's sakes. I don't see the world through a normal lens. I see the world through a very unique, very beautiful lens, for the most part. And so it was perfect to put the door between us, because I said, I think I may be way too radical. And then I got in my car and I drove away. And to his credit, I never heard from him again. And he certainly never heard from me again. So, it's interesting when you talk about boundaries, because there's a quote that comes forward for me, and it's Rumi. And there's an important distinction, I think, between barriers and boundaries. It's really great to have some boundaries. We need them. But what we don't need is barriers. And so Rumi said, it's not your job to seek for love. It's your job to seek and find all the barriers you've built against it. And so, to be clear about a barrier might be some kind of negative self-talk, like, oh gosh, I can't date a guy that looks like that. Wow, he's way out of my league, when he's actually interested in you. That would not be a boundary. That would be a barrier that we ourselves are creating. Now, a boundary, just to give an example, might be, I'm 53. I'm not particularly interested in dating younger men. It's just my preference. And so a boundary might be, I'm not going to date anybody who's less than 50. Or there could be a boundary on the other end too, or who's older than 60 or 65 or whatever it might be. But there's a difference, and it's pretty significant between barriers and boundaries.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And that example you gave was really interesting, because I think that happens, with the Me Too movement, and even the differences sometimes of how a woman may experience something versus a man who's also in the experience but having a different perception or understanding of it.
Let's talk about the Me Too movement for
Okay,
a minute.
let's go there.
Okay, because I just want to thank all the women out there
Yes.
who have been part of this movement. It has blessed me so abundantly, because what I have found is that men are so consciously aware of consent. Even when they're kissing me, they'll pull back. Is this okay? As a woman, I feel like this profound, relaxation response, because it's like men are being responsible for men and making sure the woman is in fact comfortable. So thank you to all of the Me Too'ers.
Yes.
And for the men who have heard us and responded with a real consciousness of consent. It's been a really lovely experience for me many times.
One of the things I just want to mention about boundaries again, that's coming up to me is how it seems like it's helpful to have boundaries set in advance. For dating, even for you to say the age range you want,
right,
or certain things. And some things we learn, I think, as we grow and we just have different experiences, there's learning. But I'm wondering your thoughts about that. Like, what would be, like, deal breakers could be considered boundaries based on your definition of it. So what were some of your deal breakers?
You know, my big deal breaker, and I think that's a really good point you bring up, and I actually write it into my profile. But my big deal breaker is a negative worldview. And how did I learn that? By dating a guy with a negative worldview. Like, and the way I say it, if I require something from a man, I also require it from myself. So the way I say it in my profile is what matters most to me, about you, and about us is positive worldview, magical mutual attraction. You know, and then there's a list of about 6 or 8 things, but it's not a list demanding something from the person sitting across from me. It's just a request that I'm going to show up this way, and I invite you to show up this way as well.
I really like that you put that in your profile.
Yes.
So, assuming they read it.
Right.
a lot of guys I've learned online dating, it's like if they like the picture, they think you're cute, they may not even bother reading what you put in there. But at least on 2 levels. One, if they read it, but also it's an inner declaration.
Totally. I love that.
For you.
Absolutely true. And it sets boundaries. But in a really soft way. You know, where I don't have to state, you know, because they're running inside of me. They're running in my energy field. They feel them in my energy field. That's such a good point that we've landed on right here. Because, you know, you read profiles where there's a lot of negatives, like I don't do this, no hookups, no Trump, you know, no this, no that. Like you hear it over and over. And like if I could coach the whole human family, I would say there's a way of shifting that into a positive invitation or a positive request.
Do you have an example?
You know, I think the way I said it in my profile was, I don't know if I'll get this exactly right, but I may be a rarity these days, but I believe our best shot at happiness is to find and be a deeply loving and committed partner. So right there, I have communicated no hookups. That is not what I'm looking for. And so is that a good example?
Yes,
okay,
it is. I really like that. And what I'm hearing so much is like the thoughtfulness that you've put into your profile.
And it was a work in progress. It was not an event. My profile was not an event. Like, woo! Like, I had to go up the learning curve on that too. But I think a year later, I finally landed on the profile that uniquely expresses really what's in my heart. Really who I am and what I'm looking for.
Yes.
And what I'm dreaming about. What my dream is as well. For partnership.
Yes, I love that. So speaking of partnership, I love that segue because we promised our listeners that you mentioned that you found a great guy and that you knew he was the right one based on your experiences over the past year. So let's talk about him.
Well, so interesting because so many people said to me, when you meet him, you'll know. And I was like, is that true? Like, how am I going to know? Like, how does that work? And then very recently, this is very new, so I don't want to be in any way misleading. It's not even 10 days old. But about 10 days ago, I was communicating with a man on Match, and there was something about him that just got my attention. And I was on jury duty, and he said, call me during lunch. Call me when you have a lunch break. And so I did. And we really hit it off on the phone, and I had to be in Santa Monica later that night. And so he said, I'm just going to drive in to Santa Monica tonight so we can meet and just see if there's anything here. And he drove in, and we had exactly an hour before I had to be at this other event. And the conversation was just easy. When he walked in, I just felt relaxed. I felt like everything was easy. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't excited in terms of like activating an old adolescent sort of excitement. You know, yes. I was calm. I acted my age, you know. And we just had this like really lovely conversation. And then he said, well, let's have dinner this weekend. And so we had dinner, and then we spent the whole day together on Saturday, and then the whole day together on Sunday. And I haven't had that experience before where I've actually wanted to connect like that. And so it's in its very brand new stages, but it's lovely. And, like I just kept telling myself, I just need one. This is a position that will be filled by one person. And it's okay to be patient, and it's okay to be highly selective, because it's like we offer these people, an open invitation into our lives when we're dating them, and into our hearts, and into our minds, and into our consciousness. And I don't know that he's the man for me forever, but what I do know is that I am really interested in finding out.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, it's like really showing up in the present moment, which I think is another piece of conscious dating. You're not fantasizing about the future, but really showing up and saying, okay, what's here right now? How do I feel right now? How did I feel when we were at dinner last night? And really going through the mental, emotional, physical, spiritual realms and saying, how did I feel with him mentally? How did I feel with him emotionally? Did I feel safe? How did I feel with him physically? Was there chemistry? And then spiritually, was I able to share what matters to me on a spiritual level? How comfortable was I? The biggest mistake I made when I was younger was I would pretzel myself into trying to be a good fit for the man.
Yes, I think
I
that's
no
common.
longer do that. Like, my question when I'm sitting across from the man is not, am I a good fit for you? It's, are you a good fit for me?
Oh, I love that.
It is a completely different experience.
So for our listeners, we just have about 2 minutes left. So for those that have heard our conversation, what would be an entry point? What would be something that someone can do like today? A small, we call them, there's a term called a 3-foot toss, which is something that doesn't feel scary, but it's in the direction of where you want to go.
I love the question, and I love the answer that just pops into my consciousness as you ask the question. Like, really attune inwardly. Close your eyes, put your hand over your heart and ask that a quality come forward that you want to be known by. And it can be anything. And this doesn't even have to be limited to dating. What quality at the end of your life, what do you want to have said about you? Is it joy? Is it grace? Is it beauty, abundance, loving, sweetness, peace? Whatever it is, it can be any or all of the above. But ask for a quality to come forward from your heart, and then take that quality dating profile.
Ooh.
Let's take one of the ones I just mentioned. Let's take love.
Okay.
So the question I would ask myself if I were to sit down and write my dating profile today, this 3-foot toss that you're talking about, if I knew myself as the presence of love, if I knew myself as a loving being, if I knew that my loving was incredibly valuable, what would I write about in my profile? What would I share? What would I say? And even better, what would love say about me?
I feel like you're giving me homework.
I'd love to look at that profile once you've written it too. I'd love to see what you would write about you.
Oh, don't worry. Don't worry. I'll revisit it. I'll bounce it off of you. So, Laurie, for those that are listening that would like to find you, how could someone find you?
The easiest way is Laurie.Richards. Just if you Google me, I will come up. My website will come up, and you can go from there. I have a book called Letting the Upside In. It is not about dating. It's really about finding the code that we've all had in us to really living the most gorgeous life that we can. And I work a lot with qualities, like this homework assignment. My book explains more about that and how to do that. So that might be, again, it's not dating specific, but it's consciousness specific. It's really how to show up as a conscious person, and then by extension, a conscious dater.
Well, thank you all so much for listening today. This again was Feel Good with your host, Malika Lee, and my guest today, Laurie Cash-Richards. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Feel Good, the podcast. If you did, please rate us and subscribe. Share it with your friends. You can follow me on Instagram at Ms. Malika Lee, MALIKALEE, where I'll post teasers for upcoming shows. Also, if you'd like to support the work, please visit our Patreon page, www.patreon.com/feelgood. You can sign up and subscribe and contribute in some way from $2 or more. Thank you so much. And remember, Feel Good isn't just a podcast, it's a movement.